So let's talk about Billie Holiday and her heroin addiction because that is an important part of the story, not just the persecution of her, but what led to her addiction in the first place. She came from an extremely impoverished background that involved sexual abuse, prostitution at a very young age, and of course the trauma of simply growing up black and poor at a very, very racist time in the United States. How much of that contributed to her addiction to heroin, and is her story typical of why people do become addicts? Or
Yeah,
maybe I should say, maybe perhaps a slightly more extreme example.
I think you're right. There's a really important study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study that I learned about from an amazing man I write about in the book called Dr. Gabor Mate, who's based in Vancouver. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study looked at what happens to kids when good things and bad things happen to them. And what it found that was really extraordinary is that for every traumatic experience that happens to a child, they are 2 to 4 times more likely to grow up to be an adult injecting drug user. And you might think, well, that's extraordinary. How could that be? Basically, the best evidence, as Gabor explains it really well, is when you're a kid, you learn to soothe yourself through the way your parents treat you. So if when you get upset or angry or hurt, your parents reassure you, they calm you down, over time you learn to do that. If when you're a kid, your parents can't do that, they're themselves disturbed or troubled or can't for circumstances beyond their control, you don't learn to do that. So if they respond to your pain and distress by being angry, you, as you grow up, will respond to your pain and distress by being angry. You can't soothe yourself, so you will seek things outside yourself to soothe you. This is exactly what happened to Billie Holiday. She was raped when she was 12 years old. The man who raped her was sent to prison for less time than she was.
Mm.
They sent her to a kind of reformatory school where she was treated horrendously with these nuns. They locked her in with a dead body overnight to punish her. I mean, you can't imagine how barbaric this was. And of course, then she goes to find her mother in Harlem, and her mother's working as a prostitute, and Billie Holiday, at the age of 14 or 15, starts herself being raped for money, which is what child prostitution is. And very soon she finds the most powerful intoxicant she possibly can. And it was really heartbreaking speaking to the people she worked with, and then all over the world, seeing addicts very much like her, meeting addicts very much like her, from prisons in Arizona, to all over the world, and realizing that these are, helped me to think about some of the addiction in my own family as well. These are people in terrible suffering and pain. And one of the really important things I discovered about drug addiction through the many scientists that I spoke to is addiction is not the earthquake, addiction is the aftershock. The earthquake is the terrible trauma and pain during childhood and adolescence or later, and then you deal with it. So, and that really forces us to think differently about the drug war. If the problem is drugs, then the solution is to, if you imagine this is possible, which of course it isn't, but let's go with that for a moment, the solution is to try to eradicate all the drugs in the world. If the problem actually isn't drugs, if actually the vast majority, 90% of people who use drugs have no problem with them, aren't harmed by them, and the 10% that are have this already underlying trauma and isolation, that reframes the whole thing. Well, why are we spending all this money trying to get rid of the chemical? What we have to do is spend the money helping people and supporting them. And that's not a hypothetical argument. I went to Portugal, I know you might want to talk about this later, but I went to Portugal where 15 years ago they decriminalized all drugs,
Right.
everything, right, cannabis to crack. And they decided to spend the money instead of further traumatizing addicts, they decided to spend it on helping them get jobs, to reconnect with their feelings, to get them homes. And the results have been absolutely extraordinary. It was amazing. It was really powerful after this journey of seeing how addicts have been so abused, starting right from the story of Billie Holiday.